Hopefully that's working okay. Excellent. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. This is our virtual learning session in which we are sharing the learning and insights from the evaluation we've been conducting of the Dormant Assets Northern Ireland Phase 1 grant programme. I am Lauren Roberts. I'm a director at SQW and I've been project director for this evaluation. I'm joined today by my colleague, Bill Carroll. If you want to give everyone a wave, Bill. Bill is our managing consultant who was the project manager for the final phase of the evaluation. Also on the line, we've got Anna, who's providing any technical support. Hopefully you've all got her contact details via the correspondence that Bill sent out yesterday. So if there's any issues, let her know. We've also got Jenny Fitzgerald on the call. You can all see Jenny. Jenny is the funding manager at the National Lottery Community Fund, and she'll be sharing some insights today as well. We've also got other colleagues from the National Lottery Community Fund, and we've got 3 external speakers, and we're really grateful that you've joined us today. Thank you. So we've got Joanne Barnes from Nexus. We've got Dr. Anthony Suarez from the Centre for Cross-Border Cooperation, and we've also got Richard Spratt from Cancer Focus NI. And thank you for joining us. So we will move forward, and I'll just run you through some logistics in terms of the format for today. Thank you. So we've got 90 minutes for this session. We will make every effort not to overrun. It is being recorded, so please do be aware of that. We've started the recording already. You will get a copy of the recording after today's session. You will also get a copy of the slide deck. So your cameras are off, so feel free to eat your lunch whilst we're talking. You are muted as well, and that is because we've got a lot of information that we want to convey to you, and we really do need to try and stick to time. So we will be conveying information to you. There is one quick interactive session fairly early on in the webinar that we will invite you to take part in. And we do ask that you keep virtual assistants off so there are no potential data breaches. So if we move forward, I'll just give you a quick insight into what we will be covering. So we'll be giving you an overview of the grant programme. Jenny will be talking to you about its background, the context. We'll be talking about how many organisations received funding and what the focus was. We'll then share some insights from the evaluation findings. So we'll talk about process learnings, we'll talk about outcomes emerging, and we'll talk about some broader reflections as a result of the findings generated. We'll then be hearing from the 3 grant recipients, a bit of a sort of spotlight focus, I guess, on what they did, their experiences and the outcomes achieved. We'll then be talking about learning emerging, both from the wider evidence base in terms of what works in supporting VCSE organisations, and also some examples that we picked up from funded projects. And we'll finish with what next for Dormant Assets NI and reference to some of the resources that we've produced through the evaluation. So without further ado, we will go into the quick interactive session, which hopefully will work okay for us. Bill's gonna manage this one.
Hi everybody, yeah, my name's Bill Carroll, and you'll be hearing from me a little bit later. But yeah, we thought we'd kick off today's session with a little bit of an interactive moment. So I'm going to ask everyone to, hopefully you can see my screen here, to log on to menti.com, which is kind of an interactive website that you can use. If you log on to menti.com and use the vote code there at the top, which is 83003556, you can log on using the device that you have, you're logging in from today, or using your mobile phone. But basically, we wanted to just hear from you to kind of kick off today's session. And our question that we're asking people is, in the context of the VCSE sector, what does sustainability mean to you? So when we say sustainability, what are some words, a word or some words that kind of spring to mind in the context of the VCSE sector in Northern Ireland? This is something that we kind of asked grant holders as part of our evaluation. We kind of explored in a bit of detail. So really interested to hear from kind of participants today in terms of how they would define it, what springs to mind when they hear sustainability, and whether that kind of reflects what we heard in the evaluation. So I'll give people a moment or two to get themselves sorted, but if you want to log on to, at the top of the screen there, you can see menti.com, use the code 83003556 to log in, and then just pop in some words that spring to mind when you think about sustainability in the VCSE sector. I'll give people a few seconds to have a think and also to be able to log on. People are probably racking their brains, or else struggling to get onto the website, but hopefully we'll get some responses through in a moment. Oh, we've got loads coming through. So we've got all come at once. So we can see here we've got sustainable funding, we've got collaborate, we've got governance, we've got resilience. That's a really interesting one because that's a really key theme in terms of the program and also our evaluation. Survival, governance, stability. We've got diverse income sources, succession planning, longevity, future, employment, environmental. That's really interesting as well. That's something we explored as part of the evaluation. Consistency, self-sufficient. If we've got any more, we've got another few coming through.
Lots on there about funding. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
probably to be expected. Yeah.
Future-proofed, core funding, security. Yeah, a lot about future-proofing, a lot about diversification of income and of funding as well. Staff retention and recruitment, that's also a really key theme of the evaluation. So interesting to see that coming through. Stability, peace, being able to plan ahead, having enough resources, another really key one. Well-trained staff, yeah, we'll be talking about that today as well in terms of staff training and development, impact, support, strategy. Excellent, that's really, really interesting. And yeah, as I said, really interesting to see kind of some of what we've been exploring as part of the evaluation reflected back today. So yeah, thanks everyone else for sharing it. Feel free to keep contributing if you're still having a think, and we can share this at the end in terms of what people have discussed. But I will switch back to the slides now.
Thanks, Bill, and thank you all for contributing. We will definitely touch on most, if not all, of those themes in this session. So I'm just going to quickly tell you what we did as part of the evaluation. I think just to give you a few headlines, Bill, are you bringing the slides back? Perfect. I will do that after we've heard from Jenny, who's just going to set the scene in terms of context around the programme and a bit of detail about background.
Thanks, Lauren. And as Lauren said, my name is Jenny Fitzgerald, and I'm the funding manager for the Dormant Assets programme in Northern Ireland. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this learning event. I hope you find it interesting and inspiring to hear from the evaluation of the Phase 1 grant programme. But I thought it'd be useful if I gave a short introduction to Dormant Assets funding in Northern Ireland and where the grant programme came from. As many of you are aware, in addition to being a distributor of National Lottery funding, the National Lottery Community Fund distributes money released for social purpose as laid out in the Dormant Bank and Building Society Accounts Act 2008 and the Dormant Assets Act 2022. This legislation enables funds from dormant bank accounts and other financial products to be channeled into good causes in the United Kingdom through an independent body called the Reclaim Fund. Banks and building societies make significant efforts to reunite people with their money, and customers can claim their money at any time. But in the meantime, funds are distributed to the National Lottery Community Fund, which in turn makes them available for good causes across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And each devolved administration issues policy directions on how these funds are to be used. The policy directions issued by the Department of Finance in September 2019 directed the National Lottery Community Fund to establish a dormant accounts fund to build capacity, resilience and sustainability in the third sector across Northern Ireland. And by the start of 2020, over £20 million of dormant accounts income was available to the sector here due to the accumulation of funds since the passing of the legislation. So we launched Phase 1 grant programme in January 2021, offering grants to VCSE organisations to address their specific challenges and opportunities to strengthen their capacity, sustainability and resilience. And we front-loaded the distribution of this funding to help the sector in the wake of the impact of COVID-19 and the cost of living crisis, and also to reflect the delay that the sector had faced in accessing this support. By June 2023, we'd awarded nearly £20 million to 244 organisations. We knew this was a significant and unique funding programme, and we wanted to understand the impact of the funding and share the learning from organisations that received grants so that the wider sector could benefit from their experience. So we engaged SQW, who've been carrying out an extensive and robust evaluation of the programme since November 2023, producing interim reports and hosting learning opportunities as they went along. I want to really thank SQW for their professional and diligent approach to the evaluation. It's been a pleasure working with them. And I also want to thank the stakeholders, applicants and grant holders who have given their time and considerable insight into the work. Without your input, there would be no evaluation to discuss. I hope you find today's session interesting and will take some inspiration from the knowledge gained through this significant piece of work. And I'll now hand you back over to Lauren and Bill, who will go through the evaluation's findings.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jenny. And I will echo your thanks as well. We couldn't have done this without everybody who's contributed. I'm really grateful for people giving up their time to share their insights. So in terms of the evaluation, as Jenny said, we've been working on this for about 18 months now. We are now at the end. We've produced the final report of the study. And there were two specific aims associated with the evaluation. One was around generating evidence, so evidence of the extent to which the grant programme and the funded projects are contributing to improving the resilience of voluntary, community and social enterprise organisations in Northern Ireland. The second aim was around sharing the learning emerging. So sharing the learning emerging from the funded projects and the programme, but also from the wider evidence base as well, in terms of what effective practice looks like in building sector capacity, resilience and sustainability. So to do this, we adopted a theory-based approach and we undertook data collection over the course of 3 waves of field work after an initial kind of scoping and design phase, just to make sure we were planning approaches that were appropriate. So in terms of what we practically did, there's a lot on here, lots of words. I will summarise it for you. In terms of data collection, we looked at existing evidence to start with. So we looked at data and documentation provided by the National Lottery Community Fund to learn what we could from applications, from reports, from evidence they already held. We also conducted a rapid, wider review of the broader evidence landscape over 2 phases. So we did that during the scoping phase to inform our tool design, to make sure we were asking the right questions and weren't duplicating existing evidence. But we also did this towards the end of the evaluation as well, just to see what further evidence had emerged over the course of the study and whether there was anything in the wider evidence base that kind of aligned with or maybe contradicted with our findings. We then conducted various different approaches to capture primary data collection. So we did 3 waves of online surveys. These went out to grant holders and unsuccessful applicants. And we did this over 3 waves, basically dependent on when people applied for or received their funding. We also did a short follow-up survey of those earlier grant recipients, just to find out about some of those longer term outcomes and impacts that were starting to emerge. From the surveys, we recruited for online or telephone interviews with grant holders, of which we spoke to 21, and unsuccessful applicants, of which we spoke to 7. And we also spoke to wider stakeholders and individuals within the National Lottery Community Fund to get their perspective as well. Alongside this, we developed 7 case studies with 8 organisations. We did this by going out and meeting people in person. We did virtual interviews and we looked at documentation and data that they provided to us. And there's a host of different outputs we have produced. Given the comms aim and learning share aim, it's really important that we produced outputs throughout this study rather than sitting on things till the end. We have done that. These are listed on this slide. I won't go through them all in detail now, but I'll come back to these at the end.
I'm going to now kind of talk you through some of the key learning from the Vine evaluation report. As Lauren said, there's been a lot of research activity and lots of outputs we developed and like a huge amount of really interesting insight we've gathered as part of this. So I'll try and summarize some key learning, but there's a lot more in all of the outputs that Lauren referenced previously as well, which we'll be sharing after today's session. So across a number of kind of key areas, I suppose I'm going to talk you through some of the key findings. So first of all, kind of focusing on process learnings. So as we've said, the Dormant Assets NI programme was delivered by the National Lottery Community Fund. 244 organisations received grant funding as part of the programme for a grand total of £19.9 million. The grant programme itself ran between January 2021 and March 2023, but some of the projects are running until 2027. So kind of some of the projects are completed, some of the projects were completed when we engaged with them as part of the evaluation, but some of them remain ongoing until 2027. And one of the things we looked at in the evaluation was kind of the reasons for applying. So why did these organisations apply for the Dormant Assets NI grant programme? And this is kind of against the backdrop of the voluntary community sector at the time that was dealing with things like the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the cost of living crisis, political uncertainty, a really competitive funding landscape, and also kind of wider issues around recruitment. So the most kind of common challenge that was reported by grant holders in terms of kind of the reasons for applying was around generation and diversification of income. And we found this particularly the case for those grant holders that received funding later in the programme. Some of the other kind of reasons for applying that were noted by grant holders as part of the evaluation were a limited time and resources for kind of having strategic planning, and also kind of wanting to increase skills, confidence, or kind of capability needs. So those were kind of some of the key challenges. And I suppose other reasons that grant holders applied for the grant program as opposed to other funding sources, grant holders shared it was kind of the focus on strategic activities rather than just on service delivery or on specific projects. And also the flexibility of the grant that kind of enabled them to take advantage of emerging opportunities. And also the kind of the context, as I've mentioned, but also the timing of the program was also deemed to be a really, really important factor in terms of organizations applying for the grant funding. So what did people actually do with the grant funding? So what were the kind of key activities that were funded? The grant program was used to fund a really, really wide range and diverse range of activities. We've highlighted kind of some of the most commonly reported ones here. So for example, the generation and diversification of income, as we've seen, is kind of a key reason for applying, was also one of the key activities that was reported by grant holders across the evaluation. And kind of engaging more in depth with grant holders on this point suggests that this spanned both commercial opportunities, but also kind of the broadening of public sector partnerships as well. Grant holders also really commonly reported activities related to the recruitment of new staff, and also a lot of activities related to the improvement of digital capacity or kind of digitizing of processes and materials. As I said, though, there was a real range of activities, and this is indicated by, for example, the case studies that we developed. So I'd encourage people to go and have a look after today's sessions. We've just highlighted the most commonly reported activities here today, but there is quite a range of ones that were activities that were delivered as part of the program. And in terms of kind of progress, the evaluation also indicates that the majority of grant holders have either already delivered or will deliver their grant-funded activities as planned. So to move on and look at kind of outcomes and impacts that were brought about as a result of the Dormant Assets NI program. So kind of when we think about outcomes and kind of, I suppose, kind of considering the aims of the program, which is kind of to support the VCSE sector in Northern Ireland to become more resilient, prepared for the future, kind of by way of funding activity that also increases capacity and sustainability, as we've kind of seen at the start of the session today. Some of these words we've already seen. So I think by seeking to address each of these key areas, so sustainability, resilience, and capacity, as part of the evaluation, we've explored how these can kind of lead to transformative organizational change for those organizations that did receive grant funding. So as Lauren said, we kind of conducted a survey across all three waves of our evaluation with grant holders. And one of the things we asked them about was what were the outcomes that they realized as a result of the grant program. So these are kind of, you can see here that 71% of survey respondents reported greater staff knowledge, skills, or confidence. 68% reported developing new ways of working to enhance the organization's operations. We've got some other commonly reported outcomes, such as the introduction of new income streams, implementations of systems and processes, or structures and processes which are fit for purpose, improvement to planning processes, and so on and so forth. I will kind of dig a little bit deeper into maybe the kind of the top 5 most commonly reported organizational outcomes that we've just seen there. So we have kind of greater staff knowledge, skills, and confidence as the most commonly reported organizational outcome. This was achieved in a number of ways, and kind of we heard from grant holders that included kind of achieving this outcome through paid for training and coaching sessions, which are either delivered both internally or externally. And kind of related to this outcome area, it was noted that kind of a focus on staff development demonstrated for organizations kind of a commitment to the personal growth of their staff, making their staff members feel valued and motivated, which kind of in turn improved their role satisfaction and helped kind of mitigate against staff turnover challenges. So kind of a secondary outcome related to this one is around staff retention. So that was one kind of key outcome that was reported by grant holders throughout the evaluation. The second one we have here is around development of new ways of working. So kind of new ways of working to kind of enhance operations of organizations was another really commonly reported outcome in the evaluation. This was largely reported among organizations which kind of sought to invest in practice improvements. Interestingly, it was often achieved through the recruitment of a new staff member. So this kind of happened in 2 ways in terms of kind of how we heard about this in the evaluation. There's in one way, grant holders reported kind of recruiting an experienced staff member from elsewhere with kind of transferable knowledge, whose role then was kind of dedicated to transforming the organization's processes. But the other way that we kind of saw this happen in terms of grant holders engaging with the evaluation was recruitment of staff who were actually kind of focused on operations and delivery. And by doing this, it would in turn free up time of senior leadership within the organization to develop new ways of working. So there's kind of 2 ways that organizations tended to go about this in terms of recruiting new staff to help kind of develop new ways of working. The third one we have here is the introduction of new income streams. So The majority of grant holder survey respondents, as we know, kind of intended to use the grant funding to increase or diversify their sources of income. And of those who did report this, most reported an increase in unrestricted income as a result of their dormant assets projects. Organizations kind of reported boosting their income through a variety of means. This included securing more corporate sponsorships, the generation of sales revenue via social enterprises, increased fundraising or membership due to kind of a heightened organizational profile, also increasing the number of grant organizations that they themselves receive funding from. The fourth outcome that we have here is around the implementation of systems, structures, and processes. So in some cases, organizations reported that they employed staff, as we've said, kind of to implement new structures and processes. So for example, financial reporting, HR, volunteer management, donation processing. So kind of employing staff within the organization, which kind of helps to improve both internal and external communication, and ultimately develop more efficient ways of working. In other cases, they kind of used the funding differently. So funding was used by some organizations to bring in new systems. So for example, through the introduction of a new CRM system that kind of helped streamline how an organization, for example, tracked client interactions or fulfilled external reporting requirements, such as to legal or insurance organizations. But it's interesting to see the kind of the common thread of recruitment playing a really key role in some of these organizational outcomes that we've seen. And finally, the outcome that was reported around kind of the ability to use data to demonstrate social value. Some grant holder organizations kind of sought to improve their ability to use data in demonstrating kind of the impact of their activities. So, you know, people talked about being really, really strong on delivery, but not being able to kind of communicate that more widely or externally to their organization. There was a reported focus generally by grant holders on digital infrastructure, so such as introducing systems and processes to collect activity and impact data. This was reported then as kind of in turn enabling organizations to better understand their own data requirements, identify any gaps in terms of their data, and then also to kind of take steps towards measuring their own social value as well. So those are kind of some of the key organizational outcomes that were reported, but there's a lot more detail in the outputs if you want to kind of dig into these in a bit more detail. Kind of when thinking about kind of outcomes, I suppose it's really important to consider the kind of wider context that the program is operating within when kind of looking to assess the overall impact of the grant program. And I think the question of attribution is a really important one and one that we kind of focused on throughout the evaluation. And what we mean by attribution is kind of whether grant holders would have achieved these outcomes had the grant funding not been in place. So as you can see here from our survey respondents, so more than 2/3 of survey respondents reported that they would have not been able to achieve the outcomes they reported without the Dormant Assets grant funding. And amongst all the remaining respondents, they said that while they may have been able to achieve some or all of these outcomes, they would not have achieved them to the same scale, timeliness, or quality. And also respondents kind of highlighted the grant program's focus on building kind of core organizational capacity and sustainability and resilience. And they suggested that kind of without the grant program, there would have been limited opportunities to invest in kind of activities related to building their own core operations as well. And finally, on the point of outcomes, kind of grant holders recognize that there's a number of kind of both internal and external factors which could influence the extent to which they were able to achieve these outcomes. And also the factors could influence either positively or negatively. They could have a positive impact in terms of bringing about these outcomes, or also kind of proved a bit of a challenge or a barrier to outcome achievement. So kind of some of the organizational factors kind of internally, such as organizational leadership and management buy-in, or kind of the use or development of strategies and action plans, were commonly identified as having kind of positively influenced the grant holder ability to achieve outcomes. Grant holders also flagged the kind of engagement and support from the National Lottery Community Fund as a really key factor in terms of positive influence on achieving these outcomes as well. So you can see those on the left there, some of the kind of positive factors that influence outcomes. In contrast, factors kind of external to organizations' control, such as the political climate, broader socioeconomic conditions, were deemed to have the greatest negative influence on their ability to deliver grant-funded activities or to achieve outcomes. And there were another number of ones as well, such as kind of the availability of resources, the capacity of staff, and technological challenges that may have posed a bit of a barrier or challenge to bringing about these outcomes. So some final reflections, I suppose, on kind of learning from the final evaluation report. Looking first at kind of activities and processes. So yeah, the Dormant Assets NI program was widely seen as kind of very timely and an important intervention for the sector in Northern Ireland at the time, delivered at a really challenging time for the sector. At the time of its launch, it was seeking to tackle financial issues, and organizations were seeking to tackle financial issues and often were firefighting. And as I said previously, kind of these issues were exacerbated by factors such as the aftermath of the pandemic, the end of related support related to the pandemic, the collapse of the NI executive, and the end of EU funding programs following Brexit. and also the ongoing cost of living crisis. But yeah, as I said, the program's focus on strategic activities rather than service delivery, and also the flexibility of the grant was something that grant holders really felt set it apart from other funding programs. As we said, the activities delivered generally aligned quite well or quite closely with the challenges that were identified by grant holders in terms of why they actually applied for it. And the majority of grant holders either delivered grant-funded activities as planned or will be delivering them as planned in the future. And as we said, grant holders really commonly reported challenges related to staff recruitment and retention. And then some reflections on the outcomes and impacts. So yeah, as we've seen, the grant program has brought about a number of outcomes for grant holder organizations, including, as we've seen, greater staff knowledge, skills and confidence, new ways of working to enhance the organization's operations, the introduction of new income streams, the implementation of systems and processes, and also the ability to use data to demonstrate social value. And as we've seen, the majority of grant holders attributed the grant funding to the outcomes that they achieved, either in terms of they would not have achieved them otherwise, or they would not achieve them to the same scale or within the same timeline or in the same manner. So yeah, as you can see, the grant program has improved capacity and resilience and sustainability in the sector, albeit in a very diverse range of ways, including reducing the reliance on funders, more productive and efficient ways of working, more well-established and operational and strategic plans, as well as other things like enhanced relationships, networks, and organizational profile. The grant program has provided the opportunity for grant holders to do something different to their usual operations, and most grant holders felt that it resulted in transformational change for their organizations. In thinking about longer-term outcomes and the impacts anticipated, however, some organizations were less sure if their organizations would actually become wholly sustainable or resilient following their funded activity, which is perhaps unsurprising, given the pressures on the sector. And I think a really key takeaway from the evaluation as well as this was that sustainability will likely need to be an ongoing area of focus for organizations. That's a key piece of learning that grant holders shared with us. So the longer term outcomes and impacts of the grant funded activities are expected to be realized, but it's not possible to report on all the impacts associated with the grant program at this stage. But that point about sustainability as an ongoing process was something that has come through these conversations. So yeah, as I said, to summarize, the grant program has improved capacity, resilience, and sustainability in the sector, albeit in in a diverse range of ways. I'm now going to move us along to hear from some of the grant holders themselves. So we've got some speakers with us today who are recipients of the grant funding program to give some spotlight examples of their story, I suppose, why they applied for the funding and the impact it had on their organizations. So I will just bring them onto the screen if you give me a moment. We are. So yeah, we're joined today by Joanne Barnes, who is the CEO of Nexus, which is an organisation in Northern Ireland that supports individuals impacted by sexual abuse and abusive relationships. We're also joined by Dr. Anthony Suarez, who's the director of the Centre for Cross-Border Cooperation, an independent organisation committed to the cooperation across the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And we're also joined here today by Richard Spratt, who is the Chief Executive of Cancer Focus NI, which is Northern Ireland's leading local cancer charity. So first of all, thank you all so much for being with us today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us and really looking forward to hearing a bit more from yourselves. Joanne, I might go to you first and pose the question to you in terms of why did you and your organisation apply for Dormant Assets funding?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, as an organisation, we had 3 key aims at the time of application, and it was better analysis and use of our data to support our status as sector experts. I think we had a lot of complex data sets, but we weren't, I suppose, utilising them to the best of our ability. Review and streamline our work. So we were keen to look at what we did, how we did it, and was it neatly tied back to the key ethos and objects of the charity. And then to invest and develop and retain our staff. So some of the key items that you're coming up in terms of, the broader grant funding, what organisations were hoping to achieve.
Brilliant, thanks, Joanne. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear reflects what we've heard today, reflects your own reasons for applying. Can you tell me a bit about what you actually did with the funding then? So what activities were delivered by your organisation as a result of the grant programme?
So the first one, again, very related back to your outcomes, was we employed a policy and impact officer who had the responsibility for data analysis to evidence need and experience, undertake research and respond to consultations. So it wasn't just about having that internal lens, it was also then how we were communicating that externally to influence policy change, to also influence service commissioning. So a lot of that went hand in hand with responding to consultations, political engagement of ministers, at a direct level, maybe also through all party working groups. Now, obviously, some of that time was stunted with a non-sitting assembly for a period, but we continued on with engagement with elected representatives at a local level. So yeah, that was really impactful, and something that really helped us, I suppose, articulate our value to the sector, and I suppose advocate on behalf of those with lived experience, which is crucial for the organisation. We also appointed an independent consultant to conduct and report findings of an organisational review. So they were appointed to look at our structure, our policy, our process and our practice. And as part of that was really just looking at our fitness for purpose. Did we have the right structure in place? Did we have the right skill sets that we required amongst our staffing and our personnel? But also were our policies and processes robust enough to reflect our practices? And then we also then completed a skills audit of our staff, looking at the strengths and knowledge gaps in the organisation. On the back of the organisational review, that was one of the recommendations. So that enabled us to inform an annual training plan, a training and development plan for the organisation, which we still have in place today. So we've, continued that on an annual basis, looking at our contract requirements, looking at the needs of our service users, and really then allowing us to develop our team members to respond to that.
Thanks, Ron. That's really interesting to hear about, kind of the organizational activities, but then also kind of that external piece in terms of kind of the external communications and kind of raising the profile of your organization across the sector, and also kind of the bringing in of external expertise as well to your organization. And it's really, really interesting. And then I suppose kind of what difference has the funding made? What impact has it had kind of on your organization or beneficiaries or more widely?
So I suppose over year 1 and 2, it was very operational in terms of its changes, which we would expect because, you were employing somebody, you would expect to see a direct correlation with that and the activity that they were undertaking. So as I said, we were in a position where we were able to formally respond to consultation responses, and put those out there more broadly on our website. Again, that then attracted people wanting to come and collaborate with us for research purposes. So that broadening of the optics of the organisation and what we do, and how we can, I suppose, support understanding of sexual abuse and abusive relationships, particularly in a Northern Ireland context. Definitely broader political engagement, and again the optics more externally. Also a lot of royal engagement. A couple of our royal representatives in the UK have an interest in our subject matter, so that again gained interest from them and enabled us to, I suppose, put Nexus on the map more broadly on a regional basis. The organisational review, really key to that was engagement of our people, our clients and our funders, and really looking at a 3-stage process of organisational change in terms of our structure, our policies and processes. Glad to say that process is now complete, and we feel we have a solid structure in place in the organisation. We've implemented ISO in terms of a quality management system for our policies and processes on the back of the work that was undertaken. So some legacy issues there that remain in place today. We developed a new 3-year strategic plan. We're coming to the final year of that strategic plan at present. So that's equipped as well through that process and the support of an external consultant to be able to take that on ourselves now as we look ahead to the next 3 to 5 years. As I also mentioned, the skills audit, we do that now routinely on an annual basis. What are the emerging needs? More recently, we identified the need for EMDR, which is a form of therapeutic intervention that is helpful for people who've experienced trauma and those maybe displaying symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So we were able to train 10 of our clinicians in that and be able to respond to that need, providing alternative forms of therapy that are maybe more impactful for some people. So that's one example. And then we have a power of data team that now look at our data and also have now, I suppose, in the given space in between, are now also looking at AI and its capacity to support the organisation to do its work, developing a policy around how we use AI, how we do that, I suppose, ethically, and, you know, putting in, I suppose, place guardrails for the organisation in terms of its use and how our staff can be guided in its use. So, yeah, I think overall legacy wins were really an enhanced structure, improved policies and process. Cultural change, I'd say, is underway, and we know culture is one of the hardest things to change. But certainly, you know, that engagement of staff through the organisational review, through the strategic planning process, has enabled better communication and better engagement of staff. And we also looked at through our 3-year strategic plan on resetting our values in the organisation and really ensuring that they were embedded across everything that we do and how people are appraised and how people are, I suppose, performance managed, etc. To ensure that, you know, those values are key to what we do and really that our people uphold those values and embrace them. Definitely less waste and greater efficiency in what we do, just through systems and looking at that sort of policy and process review. And we have, I think, a better understanding of the needs of the people we're supporting, and with a clearer evidence base in that, in terms of historically we were using data for reporting to funders rather than reporting the needs of the people. And, you know, I suppose when our funders ask often for data, they're looking at outputs, where we're really trying to look and display our outcomes and our impact. And really tell that longer term story. And I think when you're working with people, that's imperative, because change doesn't happen overnight and change isn't reflected in the number of people that you support on an annual basis. So yeah, being more confident to be in that space around our impact and utilising our data to that effect has really been imperative for us.
Thanks so much, Joanne. Yeah, really interesting to hear such a wide range of outcomes across, you know, different areas of your organization, and also quite interesting to hear kind of grant funded activity that maybe, you know, was towards the earlier end of the program and is finished now, to be able to kind of see some of what the legacy of that grant funded project has been. I might ask you to share a key piece of learning, but I think I'll come back to you at the end, and I'll move on to Anthony for the moment. Anthony, yeah, same question for yourself. Can you tell us a bit about kind of why your organization applied for Dormant Assets funding?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I suppose the main reasons were really a recognition that we needed to improve digital skills. Now, bearing in mind this was during COVID times, so everybody was really looking at improving their digital skills, but we wanted to do it in a way that was as professional as possible, and that would really raise our profile. Linked to that was also the need to diversify our funding streams. So we're an organisation that deals really in cross-border cooperation. So cross-border, when you're looking for funding, options are rather limited in terms of funders that will fund cross-border activity. So we really needed to look at how could we diversify our funding streams. But linked to that, we're a small organisation. The entirety of our organisation will probably fit into one of your desk drawers there. So it's also about capacity. So all of these things are linked, raising the profile, professionalisation of our digital presence, but also then professionalisation of in-person events, allowing us to diversify funding streams, but also finding, let's say, innovative ways of increasing the capacity of our organisation in terms of meeting the demands that we face. So those were the main reasons.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, that's really interesting in terms of how you've highlighted kind of how they're all interlinked. So kind of as challenges, you know, one can exacerbate the other, but also in kind of trying to address them as well. They can kind of support each other through kind of intervention. So that's really, really interesting. Can you tell me then a bit about kind of what did you do with the funding? What activities were funded as part of the grant program?
Well, one of the things that we did was actually just very straightforward purchase of equipment. In fact, I've been relegated to my own office because one of the things we did was actually equip our meeting rooms so to make sure is equipped for hybrid events. That's being used right now. So I'm in my office. Digital cameras, so kind of hard equipment to allow us to really digitalize, but also then investment in skills. So one of the things that we did was we actually contracted a professional kind of PR and communications company that by using them to kind of to improve our profile and in terms of helping us in the run up to events, at the same time they were transferring those skills to a specific member of staff within the organization. So we were using a professional, a private company to kind of transfer skills to within the organization. And then the other thing that we did using the funding was kind of develop our research platform, which is a means of attracting external contributors, which we can then use when we're looking for a specific skill set that we don't have internally in terms of research or analysis or other things, that we can actually call on those external people who have then a link to the organization. So those are the main kind of ways that we use the funding.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of kind of working towards one aim, but actually what you described there is three quite distinct and quite different kind of activities themselves in terms of kind of the purchase of actual hardware and equipment, kind of use of PR and comms professionals, and then also development of a research platform. So that's really interesting. So what difference has the funding made for your organization, Anthony? Kind of what outcomes or impacts have you seen as a result of the funding?
Well, one of the things that we see, because I forgot to mention, the funding was also used in terms when we moved out of the COVID period, then our in-person events. So one of our key events every year is our annual conference. And if you look to our annual conference 2019 pre-COVID to the post-COVID first annual conference in person, the look of them is it's completely different. And what that has meant is that we could use the conference then to attract sponsorship. So we've managed to increase the number of kind of private companies and organizations who sponsored the conference. So before the funding, it wasn't really something that we did. And now it's something that year on year we've increased that capacity to actually attract sponsors to the conference, which is a very important means of supporting what we do. The other impact that it's had, so apart then from that kind of different funding stream or funding source, the other impact that it's had is that we have now, sometimes it's kind of, well, I wouldn't say it's a curse, but sometimes it becomes a challenge. We now attract more requests in terms of becoming partners in activities, requests for us to do specific pieces of work, which again is great for us. It's other sources of funding. So that has been a great impact, a positive impact. And in terms of our profile, it is definitely increased with thanks to the funding that we received.
Interesting, kind of similar to what Joanne described in terms of that raised profile, despite kind of having quite different ways of going about it. That's quite interesting. I'll also come back to you and ask you for kind of a key tidbit of learning, Anthony. But before I do, I'll move on to Richard. Yeah, Richard, thanks for being with us. Same question again. Can you tell us a bit about kind of why your organisation applied for the Dormant Assets NI funding?
Yes, Bill, thank you. Yes, it was context for us, not dissimilar to others, was 2021. Everybody's on the ropes a little bit with COVID. I had been with Cancer Focus for about a year, and we had actually very acute operational difficulties, we're not afraid to admit, and probably due to underinvestment in our digital and IT infrastructure over many years, where IT was maybe viewed as a nice to have when it comes to budget and not integral. So our situation was really born out of necessity and a little bit of a crisis. We had staff across service teams, delivering support, cancer support services, health improvement, prevention services, not being able to access systems or data remotely. The dormant funds give us an opportunity, unlike many other funders, sort of non-project specific, but actually be able to deal with acute infrastructural issues with the organization. So ours was a pretty broad digital transformational exercise over 2 years.
Great, thanks, Richard. And yeah, can you tell us a bit about kind of what you did with the funding then, and what activities were delivered?
Yeah, so we really looked then to migrate. So across our organization, we have our services, a variety of cancer support services we have, but we also have retail and we have fundraising. So we have about 120 staff across various departments. So what we did was we needed an organizational solution. So we introduced Microsoft Teams and SharePoint, which isn't just about implementing a system, but there's a lot of work in there in terms of cultural change and training, proprietary work for that. We're dealing with a variety of systems within the project. So, for example, our financial system was very much sort of Sage, not on the cloud. People had to be in the office, similar with Razor's Edge, our fundraising system. So again, bringing those online. And then we took the opportunity as well to review and enhance our security around data. We looked at multi-factor authentication. We looked at the type of data that we collect, and particularly on the services side, it was a real opportunity actually to look at other solutions as well outside of SharePoint in terms of how we evaluate the data and evaluate the impact and the outcomes that we have as an organization and supporting people. So it was a pretty broad, holistic exercise in terms of complete organizational overhaul from an IT perspective.
Yeah. And can you talk me through then kind of the impact or the difference that the funding has made to your organization?
Yeah, I think it's been hugely transformational. So, obviously the key objective was to provide some sort of operational stability and a foundation in terms of growing, launching a new strategy around some different ways of providing services. We're embarking on a model of sort of community-based cancer support centres in Northern Ireland. So really we were able to think then strategically about how we lay the foundations for that. I think the cultural piece and the communication piece was hugely important in terms of the difference that has been made. So, for example, just things like internal communications. We have a really good internal SharePoint website now where we can communicate cross-departmentally, good news stories, celebrate things, a bit like an internal website, keep staff who are geographically remote and disconnected in various parts of Northern Ireland, feeling connected in terms of what's happening in other parts of the organization. We did a lot of really good work around, our leadership teams. So people that were leading teams or managing people, we created like an online managers forum where we can share resources and learning. We're meeting regularly, just people able to interact within teams as well, sort of across the organization that might not necessarily sit in a service or in a department, but that cross-departmental piece. I think one key difference really for us that was perhaps an unintended consequence was rather than just implement a system, we actually took a step back and thought about our process and our workflows and how we work, and asking questions like, why do we do that? How do we match a volunteer driver with a patient to drive that patient to and from radiotherapy or chemotherapy for over 5 weeks? Is there a better way of doing that? So it really generated a lot of, I think, really good efficiency in terms of process and workflow, and cutting out some sort of manual elements with that. And again, just embedding and building in a culture of ongoing training. So just this morning, actually, we had a team session around using Microsoft Teams as our telephone system, and that ongoing discipline, of doing that as a team has been really helpful. So yeah, it's made a huge difference for us as an organization. We're really thankful that we've got really good foundations now in terms of our digital infrastructure.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I'm kind of struck by what you said there in terms of asking why do we do that, and kind of the opportunity to take a bit of a step back. I think that's something that we've heard a lot throughout the evaluation from grant organizations in terms of, you know, when you're firefighting or when you're focusing on kind of, you know, just keeping things going, that you don't actually have the space to take a step back and kind of think bigger picture or think more strategically. So it's really interesting to hear that that's been your experience as well. But yeah, thank you very much for sharing. And we've got a few minutes left before we need to move us along. So I might kind of go back to each of you, if that's okay, and ask, I suppose, what's a key piece of learning for you based on your experience of the grant program? Or I suppose, framing it another way, what advice would you give to another organization kind of in a similar position to yours at the outset of the funding in terms of seeking to improve their resilience, capacity, or sustainability? Yeah, what have you learned? Joanne, I might go to you first.
A couple of things really, Bill, from ourselves. I think in the community and voluntary sector, we can quite often get caught up in delivering things at a very fast pace, or we have this reputation of being highly agile and responsive, which is great. But sometimes I think, and certainly in terms of our engagement with our team and learning and looking at culture for them, a bit of feedback was sometimes, you know, it's a marathon and not a sprint, and it's getting a balance of that right, so that you don't feel that you're potentially overwhelming people. And when you're bringing change on board or you're moving through processes, you know, to be paced, but to have that agility and flexibility that things might need to change direction. COVID being one fine example of that, and how we do business. And that has left legacy changes for how we all work and how we operate. And then the other thing, and I think the sector are very good at this, but it reinforced even further to us, is around that engagement and collaboration with others. You know, you can't do things on your own. You will need the support of other experts and other professionals in the space. But also key to that was listening to our user base and what they need. And we have more recently established a user forum within the organisation through an aftercare service, and really listening to their experience of utilising our services, the benefits of what they received, but also any challenges that they may have encountered, and how we can use that to improve the future service offering for others. So yeah, I think those would probably be the key learnings from ourselves in terms of looking at that overall future-proofing Nexus project.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joanne. I'm sure it would be very useful advice for an organisation seeking to improve their resilience and sustainability. Anthony, same question for you. What's a key piece of learning for you based on your experience of the grant program?
I would advise prepare for success, as in, I'll give you an example. So I mentioned that we have now, our meeting room is fully equipped in terms of being able to have those hybrid meetings. Well, all of that equipment has to be maintained. That's a cost. So it's kind of thinking ahead. These things that we have, thanks to the funding that have improved our capacity, you have to think these things have to be maintained. So that's one example. The other example is, I mentioned our annual conference, what they now look like and what they looked like before. It's great because we now are able to get those sponsors coming to sponsor the conference, which is great in terms of additional funding streams. But it means we can't go back in terms of quality. We can't go back to what we were before the funding. We've now reached that kind of quality, and we have to maintain it, if not actually improve it constantly, in order to continue to attract sponsors and to give us further opportunities. And I mentioned also now the increase in terms of organizations coming to us, asking us to do pieces of work. Well, think of that. What does that mean for your organization? So the success is great, but you have to plan for having that success. How are you going to maintain it? Bear in mind, also the challenge in terms of investing in skills. How do you maintain those skills within the organization if you invest it in one particular person, and then that person, because you've raised those skills, in our case, in terms of comms and events, which is highly sought after post. There's always the challenge of some other organisation much larger than yours coming along and thinking, oh, I quite like that person. You can see, having seen them the kind of events that you're organising, we quite like that person. So that's a challenge going forward. But it's prepare for success. That's the single piece of advice I would give.
Thanks, Nancy. It's a great piece of advice. You normally hear prepare for failure, but prepare for success, and make sure you're equipped, you've got the resource and capacity to kind of deliver and maintain that. And that's a really key point in terms of sustainability and maintaining the legacy as well. So no, really, really, really useful. Thanks, Anthony. Yeah, Richard, same question for yourself. What's a key piece of learning for you based on your experience of the grant program?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about this. I think our project changed a little bit, which is because we had a flexible funder and enabled that, but it changed as well because I suppose we were prepared to ask, really good questions of ourselves, coming back to not just implementing an IT solution, but actually looking really deeply at the organization and how we do what we do. So I think that's a really good thing to do anyway, that sort of, as we run and sustain our operations, but the ability then to pivot and to make changes, I think within a grant, and sometimes, just that relationship and dialogue with the funder to be able to do that. So in our case, it was actually, we were trying to hire an IT professional and it was difficult and the market was difficult. And I think that was a lot of organizations were experiencing difficulty in the recruitment of staff. So actually outsourcing was okay. We find some really good solution around that. And so I think just the mindset, with your team to be very open and available to pivot when necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that kind of, again, it relates back to your point about having the space and the headspace to think about that, but the kind of shift in mindset and kind of cultural change, I suppose, as well, which, as Joanne said, kind of can take a while to bring about, but can be really, really valuable. Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all of our speakers today, to Joanne and Anthony and Richard. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. It's been really great to kind of hear your stories, and I think really helps kind of bring the evaluation findings to life a bit, to hear about your experience of the grant program and the difference it's made. So thank you very much for being with us today. I'm going to hand back to Laura now, who's going to talk us through some kind of good practice tips based on learning from the final evaluation report.
Will do, and that sets us up really nicely for the next session. So thank you so much. There were a few things actually that seem to be common across the three of you. So very different organisations, done very different things with the funding, but actually some of the things that you were talking about really struck me in terms of key themes. Culture change, perhaps unsurprisingly, I think you all referred to that. You talked about digital, so investment in digital or new sort of ways of working, ways of looking at your data. So there's something there about the sort of systems and processes, skills and training and workforce development, which I'm going to talk to you about in a second, absolutely came up. So it's really interesting that is something that you've all thought about alongside, implementing sort of process changes. Profile and comms. I perhaps wasn't expecting to hear to the extent that we have, that actually it's really interesting in terms of how you are communicating externally and the extent to which the funding has enabled you to take a step back, to think about that, and actually then hearing about some of the outcomes that's led to. So that's really interesting. And there were a couple of things that really struck me at the end. So I think, Richard, you talked about thinking about how the organisation works, but you all talked about that, even if not saying it sort of explicitly, that actually taking that step back, thinking about how you work, what could be more effective or efficient, you were all doing that. And the other thing you all talked about was trying to embed the change. So Anthony, your point about preparing for success and thinking about sustainability planning, absolutely. It's about how to embed all of this. How to, Joanne, you talked about the sort of culture change, that's an ongoing process, it's underway. It's how to embed these changes and make them sustainable longer term. I think really interesting points and align really nicely with what we found from the wider evidence base. So I will share some learning with you now, some of which has already been covered in that session. But this is what we found out largely from the wider evidence base. So I said to you before, we did 2 stages of rapid wider evidence review, looking at essentially what was out there in terms of published and unpublished evidence, literature, resources around supporting the capacity, resilience and sustainability of the voluntary and community sector. So we identified 6 key themes, which I'm sure will chime with what you've just heard. I'll walk you through these in headline at a sort of headline level, and then I'll talk you through them in more detail. So the first was around processes, so actually planning your process, thinking through how that might work in practice. There were then 3 key themes that centre on people. So the first was around leadership and management capabilities and skills. The second was around relationship building and partnership working, so thinking externally and trying to form those collaborations, and we've obviously just heard a bit about that. And the third people-related strand was that investment in skills and training. So you've all done that, and we know that other grant-funded organisations have done that as well. There was also something in the evidence base around building unrestricted funds and looking to increase income more broadly. And the final element, and this is slightly different in that we did identify this in the wider evidence and literature base. This came across really strongly, and we know it's a real priority for the sector. However, we picked up on less evidence around this from grant-funded organisations. We got some, absolutely, and you've just heard from Joanne there around this is how this is happening in their organisation. But this is something that we heard much less about from grant-funded projects. But I will walk you through these now in more detail. So the first one was around the delivery of effective project planning processes. So basically setting up your project in the right way and ensuring it is delivered effectively. So the first thing that's really highlighted in the evidence, and this might sound really obvious, but actually it's really important to get shared agreement on clear and achievable aims and outcomes and objectives. Be really clear as an organisational board and communicate this to your staff internally, what you are seeking to achieve through this project. Getting that buy-in was seen as really important. And it was also highlighted in the evidence that it's really important that that aligns with your organisational strategic priorities. So your transformation project, and that word transformation was just used there, I think by Richard in particular, you're trying to do something transformational. It's got to align with where your organisation is going more broadly and not just be seen as an add-on project on top. There's something else that really resonates as well, which is around ensuring that there are clear timelines for delivery that are realistic, but that you've got a bit of flex in there because unexpected curveballs will emerge. We heard multiple examples around that things were much more difficult in terms of recruitment or procurement than expected, that organisations experienced turnover of staff when things weren't expected, that life and business gets in the way, and actually trying to make sure there is flex in project plans was seen as really important. But thinking about that sustainability planning, so your point, Anthony, about preparing for success was absolutely key. So making sure you are not introducing a short-term project, perhaps recruiting new staff members, etc., where things cannot be sustained longer term after the project ends. The second key theme that emerged was around that relationship building and partnership working element. So the evidence talks about the importance of collaboration, both within and outside of the voluntary and community sector. And we heard examples from grant-funded organisations of where this happened really effectively. And I've put on here about engagement with wider activities. Now, this was something that came out in the wider evidence space, but actually was something that came out as really important as an enabler in terms of how this particular programme was set up. So the grant holders that we spoke to talked about the different learning share activities and learning events that have taken place as part of the programme. And we heard some specific examples of where funded organisations, including some of those we've looked at as case study examples, attended events, made new relationships as a result, and have then collaborated after sort of making that connection. So there's definitely something there about drawing on wider activities and events to try and form those new collaborations, and perhaps think wider about who collaboration might be most useful with. The other point on here, and I think this did come up as well in terms of what you were saying, Anthony, around working with your PR company, seeking to build knowledge internally through working with organisations that you have funded. So you might not necessarily say you are working in partnership with them. You might be funding them to provide a particular service or to provide a particular expertise, for example. But actually, we heard examples, and this was really highlighted in the wider evidence base, that it can be effective if your staff or volunteers can learn from those people you are paying. So you can look to develop those skills internally. And again, that can really help with that sustainability angle. The next theme on here, again related to people, was around leadership and management capabilities. So not just thinking about maybe some of the frontline service delivery staff or volunteers, but actually we know that well-led and well-managed organisations are more sustainable, are better set up to be resilient longer term. So looking at training and development plans and skills audits, as you've talked about, Joanne, for leaders, seen as really, really important. But alongside that, it's really key to make sure the right conditions are not just about learning for learning's sake, it's about actually thinking about how this can be implemented to really improve the resilience.
Might be having some connection issues with Lauren. Oh, maybe she's back. Sorry, Lauren, we lost you for a second there, but it sounds like you're back.
If we move forward to the next slide. Perfect. Okay, hopefully I'm back for everyone. I did freeze a little bit there, but hopefully I'm back. I'll turn my camera off if it happens again. So the next people related one was investment in skills and training. So you've heard about this already, but actually there are multiple routes to achieving this. It is seen as really important in terms of making sure organisations are well placed and forward looking, but actually bringing in required skills can prove effective. So actually you might need particular expertise on a short-term basis. We've heard examples just now about bringing in consultants to provide that expertise. That was seen as one particular route. The other route was recruitment of new post holders. However, as has been talked about, there were real challenges for some organisations in recruiting the staff members they were looking for. And organisations worked really flexibly to try and overcome those challenges. So, for example, looking at whether posts could be part-time, whether responsibilities could be perhaps added on to existing staff members, whether post holders really needed to be brought into the organisation, or whether there are alternative routes to seeking those skills. But that is something that was really well thought about. The other thing that's on here in terms of skills and training was it's really highlighted in the evidence base that it can be really effective if you can develop the capabilities and capacity of your existing staff and volunteer base to deliver project activities. That can prove really effective and actually potentially more sustainable and more effective than bringing in sort of short-term external expertise, unless it's a particular skill set you are looking for. Because it can set the organisation up to continue to embed those new ways of working. The next one on here is building unrestricted funds and increasing income. Really important. And actually, I would encourage you to look at the top tips guidance that we have produced. I will share the details on that in a second. There are lots of examples in there, and there are lots of examples in the case studies that we've developed as well around how grant-funded organisations have developed ways of generating unrestricted funds. And in some cases, this has related to selling particular products or services, thinking about who they are selling those products or services to, how they are marketing them. In some cases, it's about monetising events and trying to bring in income that way. It can be about, for example, as you heard from Anthony, increased sort of sponsorship models, and this can all prove really effective in reducing reliance on short-term grant funding. The other approach to this, rather than trying to bring more income in, can be about reducing costs and creating a more efficient organisation. So looking at, for example, at the supplier base, looking at some of the processes that exist within an organisation and seeing if things can be done more effectively and efficiently. And the final key theme that I will touch on that came out, as I said, really strongly in the wider evidence base, was around demonstrating organisational impact and social value. So we know there are requirements on organisations to demonstrate their social value. We know there is potential there for voluntary and community sector organisations to really add value and be supportive of those organisations, in a funded capacity. But it's also important that VCSE organisations demonstrate their own organisational impact and social value. So we know that digital infrastructure can really help with that. So Bill talked about in the introduction of CRM systems that can really prove key in terms of streamlining data collection, streamlining reporting processes. And we heard some really specific examples from organisations, particularly at the last Learning Share event. I was having discussions with people about the introduction of CRM systems and the difference that was making. There's something about thinking about monitoring, evaluation and reporting requirements, thinking about the requirements of those you are communicating to, not just what you want to say and you think is important for your organisation, that's clearly key, but also who are you trying to, or who do you need to communicate those messages to, what will really resonate with them, and making sure that evidence and data collection processes are established accordingly. And finally, as part of that monitoring, evaluation and reporting strand, it's really important, you'll all know this, it's really important to share those qualitative insights and stories to bring things to life. Everybody's working with people, telling those sort of human stories, bringing this to life is really important and can really make a difference. So I will now hand back to Jenny, who will talk about next steps with Dormant Assets NI.
Thanks very much, Lauren. I just want to thank Lauren and Bill for this session today and their fantastic work on the evaluation of the grant programme. I hope you've all found the presentation interesting. And huge thanks also to Joanne, Anthony and Richard for sharing their first-hand experience of their projects. I'm sure you'll agree they really brought the impact of the funding to life for everybody. I'm just going to take a few minutes to outline what else we've been up to through Dormant Assets funding in Northern Ireland and also then what's next. So in addition to the grant programme, we have awarded 8 strategic grants that are focusing on large partnership approaches to sustainability. For example, we funded a project looking at income generation for arts organisations led by Arts and Business. And we funded a development grant looking at the digital capacity and support needs of the sector here, led by CFNI. And our analysis of the Phase 1 programme and the learning from the evaluation let us know that smaller grassroots organisations did not benefit as much from the programme as organisations with a bit more capacity. So in response to that, last year we delivered a grant programme that focused on increasing participation in capacity building support for smaller underrepresented community organisations, and that was Access to Resilience. We funded 25 support organisations across Northern Ireland through Access to Resilience programme that are starting their 3-year projects now, working with community organisations that have previously not engaged fully in support programmes. And then following on from that, we have in the last couple of weeks launched our new grant programme that we hope will open up access to the funding even more. I thought we'd take an opportunity to briefly tell you about that new programme, which we've named Dormant Assets for All. All of the detail about the new programme is on our website, including a recorded presentation. So this is just a short introduction to the programme basics. So what is Dormant Assets for All? So it's a programme that will award smaller grants with a simple application and assessment process. And through this programme, we want to widen access to Dormant Assets funding to make organisations stronger and be prepared for the future through increasing their skills and capacity. The programme will be open for 2 years and will provide grants of £300 to £20,000. The full eligibility criteria is on our website, with 2 specific additional eligibility requirements apply to Dormant Assets for All. And that is, firstly, your organisation must be based in Northern Ireland, and secondly, it must have been operating for at least 2 years. If you've had funding from us before, you can still apply to Dormant Assets for All. And through the programme, we'll fund new projects or work that builds on previous or existing projects. If you've had a grant from our Phase 1 programme, you're still eligible, but you'll be a lower priority than organisations that did not receive a Dormant Assets Fund grant in the past, and you'll need to explain how your new project is additional to the previous project. So what kind of activity will the programme fund? So projects must make your organisation more resilient and prepared for the future. You should do this by increasing the skills and capacity of your organisation, and you should focus on what will strengthen your organisation the most. The programme won't fund community activity, for example, wellbeing or training for your beneficiaries or for your community. So the types of projects we're expecting to receive are ones that strengthen your organisation's skills and confidence in using digital technology, or strengthen how you track and measure impact, or improve the financial skills and management of your organisation, or to improve the governance and leadership skills, or improve volunteer management and support in your organisation. The kind of costs that we're looking to fund would be around the new equipment or training costs, volunteer expenses, professional support like using a consultant or freelance. While you can apply for up to £20,000, we do recommend you only apply for what you need and what is suitable for your organisation, and you'll need to make sure the rationale is clear in your application. So under this programme, there are a number of costs we won't fund, and they are all detailed on our website. But one cost item I wanted to highlight is that we won't fund staff salaries under this programme. That's because, as you've heard earlier in the session today, we learned from our Phase 1 programme that many organisations found recruiting staff with these types of skills challenging, and it put increased pressures on them to keep the staff member on after the project. So we can fund a consultant or a freelancer to help bring new skills or experience into your organisation if that's what you need to help strengthen your organisation. But we do advise that you make sure any consultant or freelancer is offering objective advice rather than just selling a limited set of products or services. And it's really important that you think about how your organisation will find the time to select and manage a consultant and their work to do that work. And also, as we've heard earlier, to maintain any change to the processes in your organisation or to the equipment. So in terms of decisions, all applications will receive a decision within 12 weeks. And we want to increase access to Dormant Assets NI funding. So we're going to prioritise organisations that have a low income and that haven't had funding from the Phase 1 programme. Also, as we go through the programme, we'll also prioritise organisations that fill a gap in awards in terms of geographical spread or type of organisation. So you can just go to the next slide, please. Just as a recap, before you apply, I suggest that you firstly read the guidance carefully on our website and watch the full presentation that's embedded there. Next, have a discussion with your committee or board on what are the best options, and agree what's most important to strengthen your organisation for the future. As always, our funding team are available for a chat if you'd like some guidance. The programme opened on the 18th of June, and you can apply online through the Dormant Assets for All webpage. So that's all from me, and I'll just hand you back over to Lauren to wrap up today's session.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenny. So just a couple of final comments from me. We have referred to multiple different outputs as we have gone along through this presentation. I'm well aware you can't access these links whilst we are presenting to you now. When you get the slide deck after the session, you will be able to use the links. We thought it was worth putting everything in one place for you. So there has been an awful lot. As I said at the start, one of the key aims was to share learning that was emerging. We tried to do that in a range of different ways. So hopefully there is an output or a format on here that will work for you in terms of accessing some of what we have covered at a very high level and fast pace today. There's a lot more that sits behind it all. So you'll get the recording and the slides from today's event. There is the final evaluation report and associated standalone summary, both of which have been published in the past few days. They're available on the National Lottery Community Fund website. The links to those will be made available. We've also got the interim evaluation reports that we produced along the way as well. If you want to go back to look at some of the earlier learning emerging, then you can access that there. There's the top tips guide. So I covered at a very fast pace the 6 themes emerging from the wider evidence base in terms of tips for voluntary, community and social enterprise organisations to become more resilient and sustainable. The top tips guide that we produced sets out that information in a lot more detail, and I would encourage you to look at that because it does give you detailed examples from the funded projects and funded organisations of where they have put those themes and principles into practice. So hopefully there will be some tangible examples that you can learn from there. We've also collated the 7 case studies that we've developed. They provide some of those richer insights. So each of those focuses on one, or in one case 2, organisations and how they use the grant funding to really try and transform their organisation. So we set out what they were seeking to do, the activities that they undertook, the outcomes that they achieved, and also some of the key learning points that were emerging. So that will give you some of that granular learning and insight that you might find particularly relevant. We produced a blog early on that sets out some of the learning from the wider evidence base. And finally, we did produce a podcast, which is available on SQW's website, which featured Jacinta Linden from Bolster Community. Bill and I were on there sharing insights about the evaluation, and Jacinta was sharing examples and learning of how Bolster Community used the grant funding basically to become more sustainable and resilient. And in particular, she was sharing learning around building unrestricted income and focusing on sales. So really interesting practical learning there. I would encourage you to give that a listen. So there's a lot there. There's nothing else for me to say apart from massive thank yous to everybody. Thank you to you all for dialing in. Thank you to Bill and Anna and our support team on our side who've made this possible. Massive thank you to colleagues over at the National Lottery Community Fund, so Jenny, but also colleagues in the background. We've got David, Sarah, Brona, Kate and others who've enabled the evaluation to happen and also supported today's webinar. And finally, a thank you to our three speakers who I think have really brought the findings and insights to life. So thank you to Joanne, Anthony and Richard again. And we will finish now and give you all 10 minutes back. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Lauren. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.